On the morning of the third day, at the jagged base of Mount Sinai, 1,000,000 Israelites stood choking in thick furnace-black smoke. As the bedrock violently fractured beneath their feet, the air was heavy with the stench of ozone and burning rock. The blast of an unseen trumpet grew louder until it threatened to shatter the very skulls of the men and women pressed against the boundary line. Picture it. They are weeping, crushed against one another, begging Moses to make it stop. They are not asking for a clearer message. They are begging for their lives. Sit with that. Look closely at their reaction in the text. When a sound is too loud, human instinct dictates that you cover your ears and turn your head away. But the terror at Sinai is not described as an auditory overload. The panic does not match a mere amplification of volume. The desert archive preserves a bizarre sensory paradox, forcing us to ask how an entire nation survived the unmediated voice of God, and why the ancient Hebrew record insists they physically looked at a sound instead of hearing it. Listen to the precise phrasing of the King James Version in Exodus chapter 20, verse 18. "And all the people saw the thunderings, and the lightnings, and the noise of the trumpet, and the mountain smoking. And when the people saw it, they removed and stood afar off." Stop right there. Notice the impossible verb. They saw the thunderings. They saw the noise. Translators often try to clean this up, assuming it is a poetic metaphor for a chaotic, overwhelming experience. But turn the English back into the ancient Hebrew it was translated from. The word for thunderings here is Kolot, the plural of kol, which simply means voice or sound. The text explicitly states that the people visually witnessed the voice. Same mountain, same smoke, see the scene. The people are not retreating from a booming echo in the clouds. They are retreating from a physical, visual manifestation of divine speech that has crossed the threshold of the invisible and entered the material world. There is an ancient Aramaic paraphrase of the Torah called Targum Pseudo-Jonathan, read in the synagogues of antiquity to explain the deeper layers of the text. This ancient Jewish writing refuses to treat the visual nature of the voice as a metaphor. It records that when the voice of God spoke, the word became a physical, flaming entity, visibly carving its way through the air above the camp. I offer it as that, one tradition's record. Reading, not inventing. The kol, the voice, was not an invisible shockwave of sound hitting their eardrums. It was a frequency so dense, so heavy with the uncreated power of God, that it ignited upon contact with the atmosphere. It became a lethal, sparking anomaly. The elders of Israel understood that if this physical voice touched them, they would turn to ash. We have a mountain on fire and a voice that can be seen by the human eye. But the terror of the people reveals a mechanical problem in the delivery of the law. If the raw voice of God is a consuming fire, what happens when it makes physical contact with the fragile human camp? Stand in the dust where the boundary markers were set. The ground is shaking, but not from a tectonic fault. Exodus 20:18 demands that we look closely at the architecture of the sky above the camp. And all the people saw the thunderings, and the lightnings, and the noise of the trumpet, and the mountain smoking. We must dissect exactly what the human eye was registering. The anomaly is locked inside the Hebrew word translated as thunderings. The word is kolot. Watch what the text does. Kol is the foundational Hebrew noun for voice, sound, or frequency. When the King James translators encountered the plural kolot wrapped in a terrifying storm, they rendered it as thunder. It makes logical sense to a Western reader. Thunder is the loud noise inside a dark cloud. But Moses did not write that they heard the weather. He wrote a grammatical impossibility. He wrote that the nation looked up and visually tracked the voices. Read that again. This is not a description of a localized thunderstorm over the Sinai Peninsula. This is a record of auditory phenomena, tearing violently into the visible spectrum. When a human speaks, vocal cords push invisible air to create a fragile sound wave. But when the uncreated God speaks into a created, finite atmosphere, the physics of the desert shatter. The frequency of the coal is so dense, so impossibly heavy, that it cannot remain invisible. It forces its way into the physical dimension. Pull a thread from the Psalms to see how the rest of the canonical record understands this. Psalm 29 looks back at the nature of this divine frequency and declares, "The voice of the Lord divideth the flames of fire." Same word, same heavy reality. The coal does not just vibrate the eardrum, it acts as a physical, kinetic blade. It cleaves rock, it shatters the cedars of Lebanon, it splits the fire itself. Sit with that. The voice that spoke the 10 Commandments was operating as a tactile, crushing object. Look back at the strange detail in Exodus 20. The people also saw the noise of the trumpet. In Hebrew, that is the kol shofar. But there is no human army blowing a ram's horn on the granite peak of Sinai. This is the divine frequency accelerating. When the Kolot, the plural voices, hit the oxygen above the mountain, the people did not just hear a booming echo bouncing off the rock. They watched the syllables of the law ignite into bright, burning geometry. They saw the commandments carving their way through the smoke. I hold this as one reading, a careful bridge between the raw grammar of Exodus and the ancient Jewish understanding of the text. But this visible grammar creates a terrifying problem for the Israelites pressed against the boundary line. If the voice is a physical fire that can split stone and shatter cedars, then a direct hit on a fragile human body will not just cause deafness, it will result in immediate incineration. The words were coming down the mountain like a burning barrage, threatening to reduce the fragile human camp to ash. The elders of Israel witnessed something strange happen to the descending fire, just before it could strike the ground. How did a lethal, heavy frequency suddenly fracture into 70 distinct sparks? Look up at the jagged granite of Sinai. The uncreated voice is not hovering gently in the smoke. It is descending like a sheer physical weight. If the call remains intact, it will crush the camp and everyone in it. The prophet Jeremiah understood the raw mechanics of this divine frequency perfectly. Listen to the King James Version in Jeremiah 23, verse 29. "Is not my word like as a fire, saith the Lord, and like a hammer that breaketh the rock in pieces?" Stop right there. The canonical text does not describe the word of God as an invisible sound wave. It is a heavy, kinetic object. It is a hammer. It strikes. When that divine hammer drops into the finite atmosphere of the mountain, the resulting friction creates a kinetic explosion. The ancient Aramaic Targum records exactly what the elders saw. In the fraction of a second before the call hit the camp, the scribes preserved a terrifying and beautiful memory. As the voice of God released the first commandment, it struck the air like an invisible anvil and shattered. The Targum says the singular voice divided into 70 sparks of physical, visible fire. See the scene. The choking sky above the camp is suddenly filled with burning, glowing fragments of living language. I hold this as their telling, not as proven fact. But the number 70 is never an accident in the biblical world. In the ancient Hebrew cosmology, there were exactly 70 root nations on the earth, established in the genealogies of Genesis after the flood. 70 nations, 70 distinct languages. What the ancient tradition is trying to show us is that the voice did not just fracture randomly into the smoke. It divided with absolute mathematical precision. The fire was translating itself. Anchor yourself back in the canonical spine of Exodus 20:18. Watch what the text does. And all the people saw the thunderings. The plural kolot, they are standing paralyzed, watching these 70 sparking frequencies curve and cut through the darkness. Take what you always assumed about this chapter and flip it. You were likely taught that the 10 Commandments were spoken in Hebrew to a strictly Hebrew audience. But the ancient record points to something far more massive. The law was not a localized loudspeaker broadcast, meant only for the descendants of Abraham shivering in the dirt. It was a cosmic, multi-linguistic strike. Same desert, same fire. The physical voice was visibly signaling every known language on Earth in a single, simultaneous event. Sit with that. It is a stunning image, but it does not solve the panic at the boundary line. A translated spark of uncreated fire is still uncreated fire. If a burning fragment of divine language actually touches the fragile flesh of a human being, the result is catastrophic. The frequency had been brilliantly broken down. From one lethal hammer blow into 70 blazing, comprehensible pieces. But those heavy pieces were still hurtling downward. The physical word of God is falling toward the camp as a shower of visible burning sparks. The elders at the front of the crowd realize exactly what will happen the moment one of those sparks makes contact with human skin. What happens to the fragile human body when the unmediated voice of the Creator finally touches it? 40 years after the smoke cleared from the peaks of Sinai, the men who survived the boundary line stood in the dust of the Moabite plains. Moses is speaking to them, looking backward, recounting the exact mechanical terror of what happened when the coal came down. We are turning to Deuteronomy chapter 5, verses 25 and 26. The elders who spoke that day were not speaking in poetic hyperbole. They were describing a near-death physical encounter. Listen to their exact words in the King James. Now therefore, why should we die? For this great fire will consume us. If we hear the voice of the Lord, our God, any more, then we shall die. For who is there of all flesh that hath heard the voice of the living God speaking out of the midst of the fire, as we have, and lived? Stop right there. Watch what the text does. The elders fuse the two senses entirely. They do not say, if we hear the voice, God will send a fire to punish us. They say, if we hear the voice, this great fire will consume us. The sound and the flame are the exact same physical object. Hearing the frequency is the literal mechanism of incineration. See the scene. They are staring up at the divided 70-spark barrage of the coal dropping toward their tents. They understand the fragile, temporal composition of their own bodies. The Hebrew word they use for flesh is baza, meat, blood, bone, dust. They know that uncreated visible fire cannot intersect with basar without annihilating it. This is not a theological fear of a wrathful deity punishing sinners. It is a terrifying realization of raw divine physics. Take what you always assumed about their panic at the mountain and flip it. The Israelites are not rebelling in this moment. They are not rejecting the commandments of the Creator. They are doing the math of their own biology. The voice of God is a lethal object, and they are standing directly in its drop zone. Test it the way the Bereans tested everything. Look closely at the specific question the elders ask Moses in verse 26. Who is there of all flesh that hath heard and lived? They recognize that their very survival in that moment is a complete biological anomaly. The first blinding spark of the law has already reached them. They have visually registered the heavy, burning geometry of the language, yet their flesh has not melted from their bones. The camp has not turned to glass. Sit with that. The physical, blazing word of God touched the breathing camp, but the camp did not burn. The elders realized something must have intervened at the exact millisecond of impact. The fire was heavy enough to shatter rock and split the cedars of Lebanon. Yet it somehow landed gently enough to be received by mortal minds without stopping human hearts. Same mountain, same descending fire. But the trajectory of the coal was altered just before it hit the dirt. The sparking language did not slow down on its own. The raw frequency of the infinite God cannot simply dilute itself. It had to be intercepted. It had to be caught. It had to be stepped down into a frequency that the human nervous system could withstand without total system failure. The elders at Sinai survived because there was a barrier standing between the falling sparks and the fragile human boundary line. The physical fire of the law was intercepted inches above the heads of the people, who stood in the blinding smoke to catch the voice. Look through the smoke gathering just below the summit of Sinai. The heavy 70 sparks of the coal are falling in a blinding arc toward the tents of Israel. The elders are braced for the impact of uncreated fire. But before the burning language can make contact with the dust, a barrier of living architecture intercepts the descent. Moses saw them. Listen to his own record in Deuteronomy chapter 33, verse 2. As he recalls the terrifying mechanics of that day. The Lord came from Sinai. He came with 10,000s of saints. From his right hand went a fiery law for them. Stop right there. The word translated as saints in the King James is Kodesh, the holy ones, the divine council. Moses is not describing a quiet, solitary mountaintop. He is describing a heavily occupied airspace. And look closely at what is coming from the right hand, a fiery law. Turn that back into the raw Hebrew it was translated from. The phrase is Esh Dath. Esh is fire, Dath is decree or law. The canonical text perfectly matches the ancient visual memory. The law is not an invisible concept. It is a burning object. Same mountain, same descending fire, but the Eshdath does not strike the ground. It is caught. There is an ancient Jewish writing, the Book of Jubilees, called by the early church the Little Genesis and preserved whole for centuries inside the Ethiopian Bible. Jubilees pulls the camera back and shows us exactly what the Kodesh were doing inside the smoke. I hold this as their telling, not as proven fact. In the opening chapters of Jubilees, the text records that the Creator did not hurl the blazing commandments directly into the fragile camp. He spoke the heavy frequency first to a specific, high-ranking class of heavenly beings called the Angels of the Presence. They stood in the gap between the infinite, shattering power of the raw coal and the terrified biology of the human elders. They were the necessary barrier. Picture it. The angels of the presence step into the blinding light to catch the sparking anvil of the voice. They operate as immense, living step-down transformers. They receive the crushing, uncreated fire of God's frequency, absorb the lethal kinetic energy, and pass the cooled, mediated language down to the trembling camp. Mediation, not destruction. The elders of Israel survived the boundary line because the physical fire was intercepted and translated by the host of heaven. Sit with that. Take what you always assumed about the delivery of the Ten Commandments and flip it entirely. You have likely spent your life picturing God booming a loud voice directly into the eardrums of a million helpless people. But the ancient tradition insists the law was a highly choreographed handoff. The living word was passed from the uncreated fire into the hands of the holy ones, and finally into the ears of flesh and blood. The physical manifestation of the call was tamed by the angels before it could burn the camp to ash. But this ancient Ethiopian preservation is not just a forgotten apocryphal footnote. It solves a massive contradiction buried right in the middle of our canonical New Testament. Because thousands of years after the mountain went quiet, a man named Stephen stood on trial for his life, and he made a stunning claim about Sinai that seems to completely contradict the book of Exodus. What did the first century church know about the angels in the fire? stand on the polished stone floor of the council chamber in Jerusalem. It is the 1st century, thousands of years after the smoke has cleared from the Sinai Peninsula. A man named Stephen is surrounded by furious religious elites, standing trial for his life. He knows he is about to be dragged outside the city gates and crushed with stones. In his final moments, he delivers a blistering summary of Israel's history, tracing the bloodline from Abraham straight through to the wilderness. Picture it. He arrives at the defining moment of the nation. He speaks of Moses and the mountain. But listen to the exact accusation Stephen levels at the high priest in Acts chapter 7, verse 53. Who have received the law by the disposition of angels and have not kept it. Stop right there. Read that again. This is not a forgotten apocryphal footnote. This is the canonical New Testament explicitly confirming the terrifying mechanics we found in the Ethiopian text of Jubilees. Stephen does not say the law was handed directly from the uncreated God to the fragile human elders. He says it arrived by the disposition of angels. We must unlock the Greek to see what Stephen actually registered in his defense. The word translated as disposition is diatagas. It is a precise architectural and military term. It means an ordered arrangement, an intervening sequence, a delivery passed down through ranks. Stephen is telling the highest court in Jerusalem that the 10 Commandments did not bypass the heavenly host. The descending fire was caught, sequenced, and physically mediated by the angels. Take a second canonical witness from the letters of Paul. Paul was a Pharisee of Pharisees, trained at the feet of Gamaliel, steeped in the deepest ancient understandings of the Torah. When he writes to the Galatians in chapter 3, verse 19, he drops the exact same mechanical detail into the text. He writes that the law was ordained by angels in the hand of a mediator. The writer of Hebrews echoes this perfectly. In chapter 2, calling the Sinai event the word spoken by angels, same fire, same mountain. 3 distinct witnesses in the New Testament canon, all pointing back to the exact same highly occupied airspace above the camp. The uncreated voice of God was a heavy, kinetic object. It fractured into 70 blazing sparks. The angels of the presence stood inside the blinding smoke, operating as living step-down transformers. They caught the lethal frequency of the coal and cooled it into survivable human language. They held the fire so the flesh would not burn. Sit with that. The mystery of how 1 million fragile humans survived the voice of the living God is answered by the disposition of the angelic barrier. The camp did not turn to ash because the text explicitly tells us the raw voice was intercepted before it hit the dirt. But resolving the survival of the elders creates an entirely new physical problem at the summit of the peak. A mediated voice is still a voice. Even cooled and translated by the angels, a spoken syllable is an ephemeral thing. It enters the finite atmosphere, it vibrates the air, and then it dissipates into the desert wind. A sound wave cannot be held in a human hand. A frequency cannot be placed inside a wooden box. Yet the scriptural record insists that Moses did not just walk down the mountain with a mental memory of what the angels translated. He walked down the jagged rock carrying the heavy voice itself. How do you take the blazing, kinetic sparks of divine language and freeze them into a solid object heavy enough to shatter on the ground? Moses steps through the freezing, thick cloud at the summit of Sinai, moving alone past the angelic barrier that is actively translating the fire. He stands in the deep darkness. Listen to the explicit command waiting for him in the King James Version, Exodus chapter 24, verse 12. And the Lord said unto Moses, Come up to me into the mount, and be there. And I will give thee tables of stone, and a law, and commandments which I have written. Stop right there. The kinetic, 70-spark barrage of the coal has been caught and cooled by the angels. But a translated sound wave cannot be carried down a mountain. The frequency must be frozen into a physical object. Look closely at the material required to hold the uncreated voice. If the blazing syllables of the law were pressed into ordinary desert, granite, or limestone, the rock would instantly turn to glass and shatter under the divine weight. The text demands an impossible container. Turn back to Exodus chapter 24, verse 10. Just chapters earlier, the elders of Israel were brought up the lower slope and caught a fleeting glimpse of the divine space above the mountain. And they saw the God of Israel, and there was under his feet as it were a paved work of a sapphire stone, and as it were the body of heaven in his clearness. Read that again. The word in Hebrew is sapphire, a deep, translucent, celestial blue. The ancient Aramaic Targum Pseudo-Jonathan bridges the gap between the blazing visible voice and the stone container. The scribes recorded that the tablets handed to Moses were not chiseled from the dirt of the earth. They were hewn directly from the sapphire architecture of the throne itself. I hold this as their telling, not as proven fact, but the raw physics of the mountain demand it. To hold the burning frequency of the coal, the container must share the uncreated nature of the speaker. See the scene. The angels of the presence have translated the lethal fire. Now, the Creator takes that cooled, mediated language and presses it directly into the blue stone. Exodus 32-16 records the impossible physical result, and the tables were the work of God, and the writing was the writing of God, graven upon the tables. The Hebrew word for writing here is miktav. But it is not ink. It is not a shallow scratch on the surface. The ancient tradition insists the letters were living fire bored entirely through the translucent sapphire, hovering inside the stone so they could be read perfectly from any angle. The kinetic sound was trapped as visible light. Sit with that. Moses is not carrying down a heavy piece of dead masonry. He is holding the frozen, visible coal. The voice that threatened to incinerate the camp just 40 days ago has been safely encased in a sapphire vault. The terror of the boundary line has been solved. The heavy frequency can now rest inside a wooden box without burning through the floor of the tabernacle. Same mountain, same uncreated fire. But it is finally safe to touch. Moses turns away from the summit and begins the long, steep descent back toward the tents of Israel, carrying the trapped lightning of the law in his hands. But the camp, waiting for him in the valley, is no longer the terrified, trembling crowd that begged for the voice to stop. What happens when the indestructible sapphire of the coal collides with a nation that has already built a golden substitute? Go back now to the jagged boundary line where this film began. The morning of the third day, the choking furnace of Mount Sinai. 1 million Israelites weeping in the thick smoke, begging Moses to make the voice stop. You have read that chapter 100 times, picturing a terrified crowd covering their ears from a booming, overloaded thunderstorm. But tonight, you are not looking at a metaphor. You are looking at a biological anomaly. See the scene with new eyes. The uncreated frequency of the coal descends like a physical weight, shattering the sky above the camp. The heavy, kinetic voice visibly divides into 70 blazing sparks of living language. The people are not running from an echo. They are retreating from a lethal, mathematical barrage of divine fire that threatens to turn their fragile biology to ash. Same mountain, same smoke, but now you have the mechanical blueprint of their survival. The terror of Exodus 20 is not a crisis of obedience. It is the terrifying reality of divine physics, intersecting with the fragile material of the human world. The fire did not strike the dirt because it was caught. The angels of the presence stood inside the blinding cloud, operating as a living, architectural barrier. They stepped down the crushing volume of the infinite God into mediated syllables, And then the Creator pressed those cooled, burning letters entirely through the translucent depth of the celestial sapphire stone. I hold this as one reading, not the final word. But it is a reading that answers the impossible Hebrew grammar of the text. It answers why the elders firmly believed they would be incinerated by the sheer act of listening. It perfectly aligns with Stephen's dying declaration in the book of Acts that the heavenly host actively intercepted the delivery of the law. The nation at the border of the mountain did not just hear a loud noise. They saw the voices. We have resolved the panic at the borderline. We know how the fiery frequency was translated and frozen into a solid object. But the desert is still holding the rest. Moses is carrying the trapped, visible lightning of the law down the steep granite face of Sinai. The uncreated syllables are finally safe to hold, locked inside the blue stone. But less than 40 days later, he will reach the bottom of the slope, look into the camp, and see the gold of a forged idol. In a moment of absolute fury, he will raise the heavy sapphire above his head and hurl it into the bedrock. When a finite human shatters the indestructible container holding the physical voice of God, what exactly happens to the fire? Does the trapped language escape? Does the lethal kinetic energy finally strike the camp? The fragments of that first strike still lie somewhere under the Arabian sand. If you track the sparks all the way to the blue stone, comment the word "watched" below. Subscribe to this channel because we do not skim the surface of the canonical text. We sit with its strangest anomalies until they yield their ancient weight. And send this video to one specific person who loves the book of Exodus but has never seen the fire falling from the sky. The voice that spoke the world into existence is not a vibration in the air. It is an anvil,